Wolverine and Ghost Rider team up, and then they fight, and then they team up again. They're like a high school couple, but this story is amazing. Now, this initially picks up with kind of a recap to a degree that we don't need to go super in-depth into. Suffice it to say, in the Ghost Rider stories, Ghost Rider and Wolverine have kind of been teaming up a little bit. And when I say team up, I simply mean that Wolverine ripped a demon out of Ghost Rider's head. But one of the things that we're told here is that the two of them have a lot of history together. And what this does is this goes way back to the early days of really Wolverine's career with the X-Men over at the Xavier Institute and the arrival of a kid named Bram. Now, here's the cool thing. This kid is he's like the kid from The Omen, right? Like something's just a little off about him. And it's one of these things where no one knows exactly what it is that's going on. But he is brought to the Xavier Institute by a woman named Ada. Now, of course, this leads to Wolverine showing up, popping his claws, being all intimidating and all that kind of cool stuff. This is back in the day when Wolverine was like Old Testament. So like death and destruction, wrath of God, that kind of thing. But of course, almost immediately Xavier appears and then tells Wolverine to leave and sits down and starts talking with Ada. Now, what happens here is as they have this conversation, she's not bringing him here because she basically is going on the assumption that he's a mutant. She is, but she isn't. It's really more that she just doesn't understand what's happening with him. And she saw on TV how Xavier seemed to be an expert in mutants. And so in turn, she's asking him for some measure of help. Now, the reason why this is important is this actually gives us a time frame. And this tells us it happens around the time of Days of Future Past, which is to say when Xavier was making the rounds on national television, trying to publicize the peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, that kind of thing. But what Ada says is that she's a social worker who's been assigned to Bram's case, and all the other ones had basically quit. And she said that he'd been in like a dozen foster homes, but things never seemed to work out. And she says that there's just something about him that scares other people. Things happen around him, they say. Pets die, people disappear. Some say they hear strange noises, a voice that doesn't sound like his own, that doesn't sound human. And of course, she asks, are you able to help? And one of the cool things that kind of happens here, and this is actually a great throwback, you end up seeing like Nightcrawler teleport in, grab some ice cream, and then like teleport away. Kitty Pryde shows up and she's kind of upset about it, and then she leaves. This is a throwback to the Chris Claremont era of the X-Men because he would do this all the time. You would see like these small little moments that happen, and it would kind of give a really greater depth to what was going on just in general with the X-Men at the time, right? A lot of background stuff happening. So it was kind of fascinating. But Xavier chooses to read the mind of this kid, and when he does, he's met with a kind of force of energy that is incredibly overwhelming. Now, there's a couple things to glean from this, right? To the non-X-Men experienced person, they would just kind of say, okay, so like it's a really powerful being, but it's immensely powerful. And the reason for this is that when it comes to Charles Xavier, even at this point in time, his telepathy was on a whole nother level. A perfect example of this is when he got into a psychic fight with the Shadow King. And that was the whole basis behind the formation of the X-Men, that he met the Shadow King in Egypt. The two of them had a kind of psychic battle. And then he realized there are some beings out there with incredible power that originate with a kind of mutant gene that will just be straight up evil. The Shadow King's kind of like this force of evil that exists out there, right? Just like pure darkness that exists in the multiverse. But realizing that there are enemies out there like that, Xavier formed the team in the first place. The reality here, though, is that this kid is not a mutant. And even Xavier says that, right? Like, if this kid were a mutant, I would do what I could to help him, but the reality is that he's not. What you're going to need is somebody who really delves more into the realm of magic and mysticism, possibly even demonology. But the problem here is Ada gets frustrated at the idea that there are no answers to be had, and ultimately feels as though she's kind of being thrown away, right? Just sort of being dismissed by Xavier. Even for Bram himself, he's reluctant to leave. He doesn't want to go, but he's sort of drug away anyway. Now, this is a very dangerous precedent when it comes to the X-Men comics, because anybody who knows anything about mutants knows that when it comes to this kind of thing, this is when you start getting into like Clyde Wincham territory, right? Just like the Marquis of Death, this guy who was able to wipe out universes with a wave of his hand, different things along those lines. Cue every new comic book YouTuber making a video about that guy. It is inevitably going to happen. But the thing about this is that it switches over to Johnny Blaze in the early days of his career, which is to say when he was basically just like a stuntman going out there and performing these crazy feats. And of course, as we know, or at least as most people are generally aware of when it comes to Johnny Blaze, that he goes flying through the whole stunt, things go awry, he ends up basically finding himself in a position where he's about to die, he sells his soul to the devil, and then of course he ends up becoming the new Ghost Rider. The caveat to all of this is that with this being the early days of these two characters, their paths ultimately meet, but not right away. Instead, what we actually end up doing is picking up at the orphanage where the director basically tells Dr. Ada to just get rid of Bram because the other kids are terrified of him. And having him here is putting the other kids in a situation of high duress. He knows that it's not like the best thing to do, but the reality is that he just doesn't really seem to care all that much. And so in the midst of all this, really when there's like the discussion of getting rid of him and the other kids start waking up and really seem intent on like doing Bram harm, blood starts dripping onto Ada's shoulder. And when they look up and they get into the room, they end up finding that Bram has just like twisted and mutilated all these kids into like this just monstrosity of a creature, and they don't even know how to interpret what it is that they're seeing. But that's why things are popping off here, is because this cycle is repeating itself, right? Bram is doing this yet again. And so what happens is that where you have, you know, Wolverine and Colossus and Storm and all these characters gathered together in the X-Men mansion, again, this is taking place in the past, that of course you end up having Bram who arrives on the scene. Now, again, there is this kind of offhanded remark by Kitty Pryde where she asks Storm, like, why don't you do anything about this rain and just make it like clear skies? And she's like, am I some kind of a meteorologist? And the answer is like, yes, Storm, you control the weather. If I were you, everywhere I went would be 75 degrees with a cool breeze, right? That's what I would do if I could control the weather, right? I'd make it nice everywhere I went. But when Kitty Pryde gets outside to check out kind of what's going on, especially with the power going out, that Bram is just kind of standing there. And initially it freaks her out. And in fact, when Wolverine goes to the basement to get candles and comes back upstairs, Colossus is taken out, Kitty Pryde is taken out, right? And literally it's just Bram out there in this demonic form. Now, by all standards of measurement, right? If you're familiar with New Mutants, by all standards of measurement, this looks like Demon Bear. That's exactly what it looks like. And I would go so far as to argue it probably is, right? But like, this is an extremely powerful demonic force. Demon Bear is nothing to be trifled with. And in fact, it can overwhelm and overpower Charles Xavier. It's one of the most powerful forces in existence. Only like the most capable telepaths have the ability to overcome this thing. The problem here is that once we switch back over to Johnny Blaze, and Johnny Blaze is kind of recovering from his injury after having become the Ghost Rider, he has a sort of demonic compass, which is to say he sort of knows where demons are and he seeks them out. And realizing that like there is an incredibly powerful demonic force on Earth operating in the here and now, specifically at the X-Men mansion, he turns into Ghost Rider and then immediately goes on the hunt. Now, the thing about this is because he's Ghost Rider for the very first time, it's the very first time that he and Wolverine meet. And so where Demon Bear just takes off, right? Bram just like runs off and that's basically it. Wolverine is hot on his trail, only to run directly into Ghost Rider. And you actually get this fight between the two of them. And it's a really, really, really cool moment, right? Like these two guys duking it out with each other, because a fight between Wolverine and Ghost Rider is really a great question of like, who would actually win? So I want to know down in the comments section, right? If it was like a knockdown, drag out, no holds barred fight, just based strictly on their feats and what they're capable of, who wins in a fight between Ghost Rider and Wolverine? Because technically Wolverine does get overpowered here, right? Like the flaming chains and all that kind of stuff show up, you know, Ghost Rider's like, I have such sights to show you, right? It's that kind of a thing, right? Like he overpowers the guy. And so I want to know who you all think would actually come out on top in like a fight to the death between these two guys. But following this, you basically pick up with Ada, where she ends up finding Bram just kind of walking down the road. And Ada ultimately takes him in. That where he talks about how all he wanted was a family, he didn't want to be left alone, and she realizes that the director of the orphanage is just going to get rid of Bram at the first opportunity that he gets. The only person that really seems to care about him is Ada, because she's emotionally invested. And so switch over to the present day. Something's popped off. We don't know what it was, but things seem to go sideways pretty fast, because the house that Ada resided in after taking Bram in has now all gone to pot, right? Bram's all grown up. He's like an adult now. But the issue is that he has basically done the exact same thing he did before, which is twisting everybody's body parts into like this just monstrosity that resembles something that you would see in some modern art museum or something like that, right? It's pretty messed up. But with Ghost Rider and with Wolverine brought together due to this circumstance yet again, the two join forces to basically track down and destroy one of the most powerful demonic entities that's ever existed in the history of Marvel Comics. Now, one of the things that they realize in their journeys as they come across this just kind of gigantic crime scene with all these police lights and everything is that not every mutant was forced off of Earth by Orcus, that some of them actually went into hiding. These particular mutants were hiding in the wood. Now, one of the things that I want to specify is that while Bram is tracking down and killing different mutants across the Earth, he doesn't really seem to be associated directly with Orcus. But the ending of this may very well change your mind, and I'm kind of curious to see how you feel about it. But what goes on here is that in an effort to, at the very least, analyze this crime scene and see what's going on, Wolverine and Ghost Rider actually pose as what are basically forensics guys. So once they get to like the main crime scene itself, dressing up in disguises, they literally tell the cops just go ahead and get out of there while they analyze the whole scene. And in that moment, the Ghost Rider tries to manifest. Now that's one of the things to remember about what Benjamin Percy's doing right now with the Ghost Rider comics. It's very much a return to the old Ghost Rider stories from way back in the day, which is to say the Ghost Rider persona is almost like a demonic barometer, right? The closer they get to demonic or evil or corrupt or somehow negative energy, the more the Ghost Rider persona tries to manifest. And so in this moment, it's just kind of frustrated by the fact that it can't come out and they can't just wipe out anybody who's doing anything that's particularly evil. Now, again, that's an important distinction to understand because in their travels, they're surrounded at all times by people who are just doing really bad stuff. Maybe it's a drug dealer, maybe it's this person doing this or that person doing that. And the Ghost Rider wants to punish them. But because the focus of Johnny Blaze is literally just this like tunnel vision on Bram, it ultimately forces the Ghost Rider persona to kind of keep itself at bay. But what ends up happening here is Wolverine calls in a favor with Geoff Bannister. Now, Geoff Bannister was introduced to us in the main Wolverine comics. The only thing you really need to know within the confines of this story is that he's a contact that Wolverine has in the CIA. And so what it does is it allows Wolverine and Ghost Rider to use a kind of satellite office to basically analyze everything that's going on with regards to this mutant DNA, any kind of common trail they may have that may give them some measure of information. Now, initially, Wolverine's idea is to hunt down anything or track down anything that has to do with mutants, and it makes perfect sense just because of the fact that Bram is killing mutants. It's the best place to start. But from Johnny Blaze's perspective, this guy just reeks of demonic energy. So the best thing they can do is to actually analyze anything out there that has to do with demonology, right? That's the best route that they can go, because while following the mutant trail would inevitably lead them to Bram, the idea of Johnny Blaze is following this trail will basically get us there faster. Now, the information that they're able to glean is somewhat helpful, but it doesn't give them like a direct beeline. Instead, it basically sends them on the path to the orphanage that Bram was at when he was a younger kid. Because remember, when they initially encountered Bram in their younger years, they didn't really know anything about him, right? Like Wolverine met the little kid at some point, but because of the fight that took place between Wolverine and Ghost Rider, Bram had basically gotten away, right? He was removed from the whole situation, and there was no conceivable way to locate him again. So the best place they could possibly do was get to this orphanage and then just kind of go from there. What ends up happening is that once they get in there, the guy who runs the orphanage initially thinks like they're cops or they're like reporters or something along those lines, because they're asking questions about the quote unquote orphan murders from back in the day, a very well publicized event when it originally happened. But as Johnny Blaze is walking through there, the Ghost Rider persona tells him to open a door that he comes across, which has all these different locks on the outside. When he does, like when he actually opens this door, there's a kid inside who's basically stuck in one half of an Iron Maiden. And he basically tells him like, he puts us in here when we're bad. And in this moment, Johnny Blaze plays the game of yes, but maybe. Yes, it's important to keep the Ghost Rider persona under control, but maybe, maybe this is the time to just let it out. So he tells the kid, like, run, you need to leave. You don't want to see what's about to happen next. And that's when the Ghost Rider persona pops out, because this guy is in effect tormenting orphans. And so Wolverine's response here is, okay, something you got to understand, man, this room has now become what we call the truth room. And this is your chance to tell the truth, lest you spend the rest of your days in agonizing pain and suffering. Now, what we see here is something that we actually haven't seen in the Ghost Rider comics recently. And a lot of you guys have asked about that. A lot of you guys have asked, when are we going to see the Ghost Rider do the penance stare? And that's exactly what we get. It's this amazing moment, right, where he says, the way to extract information is through pain and penance. And he gives this guy the penance stare. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what the penance stare is, it's basically an ability of the Ghost Rider to force a person to feel all the pain they've ever inflicted anybody all at one time. Now, the penance stare is used in different ways. Sometimes it's used as a form of punishment, and literally it just kind of leaves the person in a catatonic state. Sometimes it'll kill them, sometimes they'll go insane, but in this instance, it's being used for information. So I would go so far as to argue it may very well not be the full-on penance stare with the 100% potency that you normally see, because this guy's still conscious. He's still living, right? Like, I mean, he hasn't been driven to the point of insanity and is like clawing his eyes out of his head, you know, out of just complete and total madness. But what he does is he simply says, somebody was here a month ago, someone asking the same questions, they took the files on Bram. And so despite the fact that the files are gone, Ghost Rider is able to kind of see the files in his own mind, because of course this guy had witnessed the files as well. Those memories are transferred. They're of course in turn transferred to Wolverine, and that's when he gets to see the totality of the nature of Bram. That ever since this kid was little, right, like when he was first brought to the orphanage, this has been his whole shtick, right? Like going through and basically tormenting, mutilating the whole nine yards, any number of things, but just appearing incredibly disturbed. And in fact, there was a particular instance here when there was a suspicion of him having like schizophrenia. Of course, we also learn his name is Bram Stroud. And so with this information, Ghost Rider in turn informs Wolverine, the man who removed the files worked for the government. He had a federal warrant. The address listed should be familiar to us both. Hell's Backbone in Utah, where we raced the devil once before, right? That took place in the Ghost Rider comics. It was a pretty cool moment because Wolverine basically ripped a demon out of Ghost Rider's head. It was pretty dope, right? But he says it's a frail spot, a place where things spill over, a perfect location for their research. What's happening here is research is being conducted regarding a Hellfire addition to the Weapons Plus program, which is exciting. For those of you guys who don't know what this is, right? Anybody who's been reading Wolverine long enough knows that like Weapons Plus, like when they come into the mix, that's when things get amazing. Because Weapons Plus started out as kind of a precursor to Project Wide Awake, right? Going with Grant Morrison's X-Men run, Weapons Plus was an anti-mutant government agenda that was kind of an orchestration between the United States CIA and then eventually Canada's Department H. Captain America was Weapon 1, right? Grant Morrison's X-Men established that. And then you got weapons 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to weapon 10, which is Wolverine, also known as Weapon X. The whole idea behind Weapons Plus is to basically just create super soldiers. And if they're able to find a way to harness a being with demonic power that can in turn be used for their own purposes, I mean, it would dwarf anything and everything that came before. There's no telling what could come out of this. So jumping back to the past, what we end up doing is picking up with Bram, where he's brought to really like an old folks home, right? Hospice and home care. And what we find out here is that this demon kind of has to feed. If it doesn't, it'll just simply seize control of Bram, and Bram will just attack whoever happens to be in sight, regardless of the circumstance. So it's just kind of letting the beast loose for a moment. And it's pretty dark, because what ends up happening is this kind of adopted mom, if you want to call her that, when she gets there, they pay a guy under the table, and this kid in turn just like destroys this old lady, right? The beast comes out, just completely annihilates her, and that's it. Now, one of the interesting things about this, and it wasn't something that's really been explored until now, Bram doesn't like this life. He doesn't like being possessed by this demon, this kind of entity. We sort of knew that to a degree, but we didn't really know how far reaching it was. Obviously, this would have some kind of an impact on a younger kid like this, but then you switch over to Wolverine and Ghost Rider, right? Now, of course, these two are just flying out, right? They're just hauling over to like the devil's racing ground, basically is what it is. But they're going there to find what is in effect this kind of demonic process that deals with the Weapons Plus program. Now, one of the things we talked about in the previous video, and I think it's worth reiterating here, Weapons Plus has a long history. A lot of people associate it specifically with Wolverine, but it's much bigger than that, right? Weapons Plus, at least Weapon 1, was Captain America if Grant Morrison's new X-Men is to be believed. And then you had just different programs that came after that focused on creating like other super soldiers following the perceived death of Steve Rogers at the end of World War II. Wolverine was just the 10th iteration of that. But you've also got Frank Simpson, right? Then you've got like the Stepford Cuckoos, who are like clones of Emma Frost. You've got Phantom X. You have all these different characters that are out there. The recreation or the restructuring of Weapons Plus, at least as it's being used here, is combining demonic energy with beings who are out there that can be used to basically create super soldiers that have demonic power. But like so many organizations out there, this one is again out for the mutant population. And that's one of the things that was largely built on with the work of really Jonathan Hickman and like the introduction of Orchis, the anti-mutant organization, the X-Men taking off to Krakoa. They made a lot of enemies, and there's a lot of groups out there that have been biding their time and waiting for a chance to basically destroy the mutant population. And while Orchis is responsible for the brunt of their seeming annihilation, although again, they're not all dead, that it's really kind of cleanup duty for the smaller organizations that are out there, right? They see it as their time to shine. And so at that point, this focuses on the learned arrival that Wolverine and Johnny Blaze are coming. And what you have here is a guy named Father Pike. And literally, it's just kind of like these guys are on their way. Father Pike doesn't care too much about Johnny Blaze. The person he's after is Wolverine. So again, we don't really know how far reaching this goes with this guy, but it is cool. And so at that point, you switch over to Geoff Bannister, who was introduced in the Wolverine comics as being what's basically Wolverine's contact in the CIA, as well as a great friend. The issue is he's been doing some kind of recon work on the side, focusing a lot on like demonic stories and information and so on and so forth. But what he was warned about by Johnny Blaze and really the Ghost Rider was, if you stare into the abyss will stare back. Do not get too deep into all of this research, because you're talking about demonic stuff, right? It doesn't just require you to be messing with tarot cards in the real life, right? This transfers its energy and its essence through a variety of different methods, different mediums. And one of these can be through computers. And so staring into this stuff too much, suddenly he's met by not really possession, but he's influenced by the powers of hell. Now, it's one of the things that I love about how this is done, because when you look at Marvel, much like DC, there are two sides of it, right? You have like the X-Men, the Avengers, Fantastic Four, the crazy adventure, wonky stories, Spider-Man that you normally get with like traditional superhero stuff. Once you start getting into Ghost Rider, or once you start getting into Man-Thing, you start getting into Doctor Strange to a degree, and Wolverine, depending on who's writing the story, you get into this whole other mythos, right? Where you deal with guys like Mephisto and so on and so forth, just like Damon Hellstrom, these demonic beings and the power they possess. And so where Geoff Bannister Bannister is infected by this and is in fact actually driven to like stab himself, right, by all these different things, that Talia Warroad breaks into the scene. Now, Talia was introduced in the Ghost Rider comic books, and she was at least an agent for the FBI, kind of working for like their supernatural division. Ultimately, they parted ways, but she has kind of been like the sidekick, so to speak, and I use that term loosely for lack of a better word, but she's been a kind of sidekick for Johnny Blaze, joining him on his journey as he's trying to destroy all the different demons that exist out there in the world that basically rose up during his absence. But it is cool to see that she's involved here. And in fact, she even gives Geoff Bannister a little bit of a kind of concoction that helps to keep these demonic forces at bay, basically push him back, prevent him from being possessed. And then she kind of warns him, like, do not delve too deep into this stuff, right? You're like an amateur here. You don't know what you're getting into. Who knows what you could unleash out here into the world? It's not for the faint of heart, right? So you don't really get a whole lot with her. It's really her just kind of issuing a warning and then seemingly sticking around. But you transition to Wolverine and Johnny Blaze once they get into the facility itself. And what they find here is that unlike in years past, when Weapons Plus just would modify human beings, or they would turn somebody like Wade Wilson into what would basically become Deadpool, you know, so on and so forth, that what you have going on is, again, them trying to create demon beings, right? Demonic monsters by basically restructuring human DNA and so on and so forth. It doesn't really seem to work, but as they're making their way through here, suddenly they're hit by the helmets of Weapons Plus. These are basically training helmets. They would throw them on the heads of people who were basically being subjected to like mental conditioning. That's why Wolverine says like, not again, because it's what they did to him when he was part of Weapons Plus. It's a way to shut their minds down, but also force them to see things that aren't there and so on and so forth. And so what we end up doing is picking up with Bram in the Weapons Plus laboratory in the here and now. And he's still much older and he still shuns his possession here. Not only that, we actually get a name for the being that he's possessed by, which is Bagra Ghul. Now, Bagra Ghul is wholly introduced into this. As far as I'm aware, there's never really been a presence for his character in Marvel Comics before. My initial thought is that it was Demon Bear, right? Like, they look almost exactly alike. It seems like Bagra Ghul manifests more as a bear than anything else, but it may just be because of the kind of terror that it instills in humans who see it. We don't really know the whole motivation, but Father Pike, in speaking to Bram, kind of refers to this as a bit of a gift, right? Bram refers to it as a curse and has for the longest time. And even Father Pike says, we gave you the opportunity to be part of an army. You have done what we asked of you, but only with the greatest reluctance. So we have enlisted a more worthy soldier to take your place. Now, where Bram recognizes Wolverine, if for no other reason than the encounter that they had when he was younger, Father Pike talks about how Wolverine has a reputation, but he doesn't really understand the relationship between Bram and Wolverine, which is to say, they know each other, or at least they've met at some point in time. But what they do here is they create a kind of process to allow this demonic transference. And it's one of those things where when Bram asks, like, will I be myself again? The response to Father Pike is, there will be no more pain. That I can promise, right? So seemingly, they're going to kill Bram off. Guys like Father Pike don't make statements like that unless something nefarious is going to come out of it. And so following that, Wolverine kind of muses to himself about his own berserker rage. With his mind kind of being shut down, what it looks like is he's consciously aware of what's going on, but he's there and not there at the same time. And so he says, like, Johnny talked to me about what it feels like when the Ghost Rider takes over. He says it's like watching a horror movie on a top volume TV that's plugged into your skull. I can relate. When rage finds me, I become someone else. Sometimes breathing heavy, I'll take in the wreckage all around me, the blood dripping from my claws, and hardly know how it happened. I feel the same potential for unchained violence now. I'm here, but I'm not here. They're controlling me, and soon that demon, that Stitcher, that Bagra Ghul, or whatever the hell it's called, will control me. So what Wolverine is talking about here is he's talking about his berserker rage, right? That whenever Wolverine finds himself in a heightened state of duress and loses control, quote unquote, his madness takes over. He becomes an animal. And it's the reason why whenever Wolverine goes into a berserker rage and the X-Men realize what's happening, unless someone like Xavier or Jean Grey's there that can use their telepathy to like calm him down, everybody gives him a wide berth because he does not differentiate between friend or foe. And so following this, Father Pike basically commences with the merging of these two guys, right? Or at least passing the demon entity from one to the other. And following that, Wolverine becomes the Hellverine, right? Literally a demonically possessed Wolverine. He says, my veins burn like channels of lava. I feel jaws gobbling the inside and the outside of me, but somehow I managed to break free for one last stand before Bagragul stitches himself onto me, and I become Hellverine, right? Possessed by a demon, and he looks amazing. And so simply just following orders, what ends up happening is he is sent by Father Pike out into the world to kill every mutant he can possibly find. 5 mutants are detected within 159 miles. Something to understand here, this is not the first time that's happened, and Wolverine possessed by a demon is more than enough to not only wipe out the entirety of the remaining mutants on Earth outside of some crazy level reality warper, but is also capable of wiping out most all superheroes on Earth. This guy could kill the world. We know because he did it at one point in time in Marvel Comics, but he's basically set upon the path of finding whatever mutants he can find across the world, and really the United States, if we're being honest with ourselves, and kill them where he can. Now, there is a whole motivation behind that. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get through this story, but this initially picks up at Cedar City, Utah, which is almost in the immediate vicinity of Project Hellfire. And again, we'll discuss the nature of Project Hellfire because it's really cool. But like him going on this warpath is really more the result of these mutants who are basically blowing up this house because the house was taken from them. Now, that's one of the things that I do want to make you guys aware of. This is why I say what's going on with Fall of X right now is very similar to what we saw with Chris Claremont's X-Men run with Uncanny X-Men and like Project Wide Awake and all that kind of stuff. Because much in the same way that you saw the mutant population fighting back for their own rights, really, in like the old Chris Claremont X-Men stories, you're seeing that here. And what's going on is there are a couple of mutants that are just riding around from neighborhood to neighborhood, blowing up people's entire homes. They're kind of taking like pot shots at humanity, guerrilla warfare tactics, if you want to call it that, right? The human race took our homes, they took away our right to exist. We're going to take their homes and their lives, right? We're just going to blow the whole place up with them in it. And so this ultimately brings the attention of Hellverine. Now, depending on your perspective, this is a terrible decision for these guys to be doing, because the best thing the mutant population could be doing right now is laying low, marshaling their forces and biding their time. Because if humanity truly believes that they are dead and gone, it's only a matter of time before they begin to lower their guard. And when that happens, you strike, right? Like when they're at their weakest point, when they believe that everything is safe, that's when you strike, because you catch them completely and totally unaware. Now, for Hellverine himself, showing up here and attacking these guys, he kills them on the spot. And then he basically starts restructuring their bodies into this really grotesque form of art, only to discover that there's actually a baby in the car. And this is when he's given instruction by Father Pike, which is take it out, right? Like eliminate it. And that's where you start to see this kind of inner turmoil with Wolverine. Now, for his part, Johnny Blaze, the Ghost Rider, tries to step in, but like we covered in the last video, both he and Wolverine had already been captured. And Johnny Blaze has this kind of mind control helmet put over his head that prevents the Ghost Rider from manifesting. More so than that, this is how the demon was bonded to Wolverine, just because of the fact that with Wolverine under their control, they can seemingly do anything they want with him, which includes bonding a demon to him and sending him out as a kind of force of nature into the world. And so following that, you pick up with Talia Warroad and Geoff Bannister. Now, like we've talked about before, Talia isn't really like the sidekick of Johnny Blaze. She's more of like a person that deals with the occult that's kind of helping him on his journey. And then Geoff Bannister is the contact for Wolverine in the CIA. The two of them are literally hot on the trail trying to find both Johnny Blaze and Wolverine. But this is when we get some really cool backstory about the nature of Bagragul. And a lot of you guys called this in the last video. Kudos to you for getting it right. I wasn't 100% sure of whether or not it was true, but as it turns out, Bagragul was created by the demon Mephisto. Now, the reason why I say I wasn't 100% sure it was true is because there were demons that existed in Marvel Comics before Mephisto. There are those who came into existence around the same time as him, and some who came into existence after. So it's not as though Mephisto is quite literally the Marvel Comics equivalent of Lucifer Morningstar from Judeo-Christianity, right? The first of the fall fallen, that kind of thing, the original demon. He's basically just a Hell Lord. And there's a whole bunch of those that run around Marvel Comics. He's just the most popular one. But this guy created Bagragul literally just out of sheer boredom. We're told that, right? Like, he was bored by the mundane nature of the suffering all around him. This devil, as we all know, has style. You can find him in the finest silks, the most decadent desserts, ostentatious architecture, luscious guitar licks, and sumptuous curves of flesh. Sin can be a beautiful thing. Now, what they're talking about here in relation to this, and this is kind of a sidetrack on the nature of Mephisto, longtime readers of Marvel already know this. So this is really more for the new reader. Mephisto is this guy that will approach you in any point when you seem to be your most vulnerable, or when it's the best possible opportunity for him to strike a bargain with you. It doesn't necessarily have to be something where like your life is coming to an end, or if you lost everything and you'll do anything to somehow get it all back. It's not always like that, right? It's maybe just some kind of guy out there who is in an orchestra and he wants to be the best violinist. And so Mephisto will come to him and he will make a deal. And what Mephisto does is he'll give you the bargain that you're asking for, just not in the way that you think. Because sure, right, you'll become the best violinist in existence, but like your fingers will be numb, right? Or like you'll lose your hands in a car wreck or something along those lines. So you have all the skill to be the best violinist that was ever in existence. You just won't be able to do it. And then when you die, he'll get your soul, right? He'll collect your soul. So he kind of appears in everything, right? He's always out there lurking, waiting for a chance to manipulate people. And so that's why we're told Bagragul was created to make art out of punishment, art out of death. That is its compulsion, to kill beautifully and erect bloody monuments in celebration of Mephisto. So that's why it does the things that it does. Now, in terms of why it's going after the mutant population, that's where Geoff Bannister really begins to understand what's going on here. That the nature of really Bagragul and the character of Bram, who was introduced to us in this story as Bagragul's first human host, came in the form of the fact that Bram's parents worshiped the dark. And they, of course, produced Bram in a cemetery on top of a grave of a guy who had been convicted and hanged for murder. And so it's like the most sinful act that a person could possibly engage in. This basically allowed the offspring, right, Bram, to become a vessel for Bagragul, who was just waiting for his time to take over the boy. Once they get to Project Hellfire, it all starts to click for Geoff, and he starts to realize this is just a government program, that what the government is looking to do once they became aware of Bram is basically harness demonic energy. Now, that's not uncommon for the government to do, and that's the nature of the side projects, right? Weapons Plus, and then all the weapons that came under it, weapons 1, 2, 3, all the way up to weapon 10 and beyond, right? Weapon 10 being Wolverine. The whole thing behind this is that the federal government is always looking for a way to create some kind of super soldier. Sometimes that super soldier comes in the form of a Captain America type person, right? A serum that they're injected with, they're exposed to radiation, they come out and they can just run really fast and punch really hard. Other times it's bonding adamantium to people's skeletons. But any method that they can use to develop some kind of a super soldier that can be used in next gen warfare, they will take. They always contract out in doing so. And so seemingly the federal government is well aware of what it is that Father Pike is doing, but the ends justify the means. Because if what they can do is take a demonic entity and then bond it to a living host or an entire platoon of soldiers, they would basically dominate the entirety of modern warfare, right? Nobody would be able to overcome them. So it is very, very shady, but it's just the nature of government programs in Marvel Comics. And so Wolverine, who's still kind of wrestling with this demonic side and being ordered to take this kid out, he ultimately rejects it, right? Like he says, no, that's not going to happen. And he stabs himself in order to kind of try to bring himself back to a degree. Because remember, the way in which Wolverine is able to regain his senses, at least as best he can, is by inflicting pain on himself. And so where he's told by Father Pike, you serve Mephisto, you serve the United States government, and you serve me. Ultimately, Wolverine seems to be able to overcome this, if just only by a small measure. And so this leads to Father Pike basically teleporting out and then in turn, traveling directly to Wolverine himself. Now, once he's gone and out of the picture, that's when Talia and Geoff Bannister show up here and then free Johnny Blaze from his control. And this goes exactly the way that you would expect, and it's amazing, because where Hellverine is back on the prowl with control being retaken by Bagra Ghul and Father Pike, he heads towards this town that has 97 mutants in it. And understand, he will lay waste to the entire place. There will be no discerning between innocent and guilty in his eyes. Everyone will die if that's what ends up happening. And so what ends up going on is that because this is all done by way of the mind control helmet, Geoff Bannister destroys the helmet, which basically takes away any mind control that Father Pike has over Wolverine, albeit he's still possessed by the demon entity. And then Talia Warroad removes the helmet from Johnny Blaze and says, free the Ghost Rider, right? Like, this is the only thing that's going to be able to stop Bagra Ghul. Nothing else is going to be able to end this guy, because remember, the nature of the Ghost Rider is that it was also created by Mephisto, but it was created by Mephisto to have just unrivaled levels of power. It's one of the reasons why Ghost Rider is so astronomically capable. He can go against the Hulk, he can stand against Galactus. I mean, it's crazy how much power this guy has. So Ghost Rider immediately manifests and then takes off after Wolverine. The kicker about all this is that with Bram being the original host and Bagra Ghul being taken away from Bram, Bram doesn't want to lose it anymore. And in fact, he wants it back. And Father Pike actually kind of agrees to allow it to happen, because what Father Pike starts to realize is that where Wolverine is kind of like the perfect killing machine, and under an ideal circumstance, he's the best person to be bonded to this, Wolverine has his own moral compass. And whether it's through telepathic conditioning from his time with the X-Men, Jean Grey, Professor Xavier, perhaps even Emma Frost to a degree, or just his experience in dealing with these kinds of things, he's not allowing himself to fully bond, right? Like, they can control him, but they can't fully dominate him, if that makes any sense. But Bram, on the other hand, is a willing host, and he'll do whatever it is they tell him to do. And the reason for this is that ever since Bagra Ghul was taken away from him, he is just having an incredibly difficult time coping. He's having an incredibly difficult time feeling whole. He wants the demon back. And so once he reaches out and tries to collect it unto himself, Ghost Rider shows up, crashes into Wolverine, and is just like, so we've been hunting this demon for so many years. Tonight, we're sending him back to hell. And it's like the coolest thing ever, because now it's literally just straight up Ghost Rider fighting against this ridiculously powerful demonic force. And Bagra Ghul knows exactly who Ghost Rider is, right? It's not as though he had no idea or no knowledge about Ghost Rider or anything. He doesn't really express a whole lot of fear here, like, oh my God, it's Ghost Rider, what am I gonna do? It's not really anything like that, but it's like, you failed Mephisto. Your job was to be a force of reckoning on Earth for Mephisto, and you turned against him, and you basically became a force that sends his forces back to hell. And so he's like, I will make a monument of your bones for every demon in hell to piss on. And the response of Ghost Rider is, you cannot punish me because I exist in a state of constant punishment, and I am no one's servant, right? And so he says, wake up, Wolverine. Just because you carry chains does not mean you are a slave to Mephisto, which is true, because Johnny Blaze was supposed to be a slave to Mephisto. He escaped that fate, and then he became a guy who traveled around the world and sent demons back to hell. And so while Father Pike is watching all of this, he's just kind of astonished by it all, because Wolverine, as the Hellverine possessed by Bagra Ghul, actually starts to overcome Ghost Rider and doesn't really kill him, but he seemingly overpowers him. And so Father Pike says, like, come with us, right? But the response of Wolverine is, no, like, I'm done with all of this. And so Father Pike pulls Bagra Ghul directly out of Wolverine and starts to reinsert the entity back into Bram. And the funny thing here is that Wolverine is kind of able to pull it back unto himself, right? And just say, no, like, that's not going to happen. So what this does is it really introduces the idea that despite all the power that Bagra Ghul has as a demonic entity, he's still beholden to the will of whatever host he's bonded to, which is a great caveat here. It's a great way to explain why it doesn't just jump from one host to the next, wreaking havoc around the entirety of the world. I do love that, right? And in fact, that's been an on-running theme in the Ghost Rider comics for quite some time. And so what ends up happening is that using this one last bit of power that he has at his disposal, Hellverine stabs Father Pike, right, kills him on the spot using his claws, and then in turn, throws him into the fire pits that are going to send him to hell. Because what had happened is he had opened a kind of portal of sorts, beseeching Mephisto, asking for Mephisto's aid in harnessing and controlling the power of Bagragul. Well, now Father Pike gets exactly what he's looking for, right? Like, you called down the thunder, my friend, and now you got it. You wanted to see Mephisto? Go see him, right? Spend the rest of eternity burning in hell. Mephisto's gonna be happy to have you there, right? He doesn't care who's in hell, as long as he has the most number of people in his section of hell. Following that, Bram jumps onto Wolverine and then immediately starts absorbing the entirety of Bagragul into himself. And that's when Ghost Rider makes this amazing monologue, right? He says, the spirit is a curse, but it's a curse I have to live with. We're entwined at this point, one and the same. I know the Rider feels the same as me. So as powerful as Wolverine might be, Bram is home for Bagragul. They've killed together, now they'll die together, caught in the punishing light of my damnation stare. Now, the damnation stare of Johnny Blaze is a relatively new ability that was introduced in 2019, but we haven't really seen it used all that often. So this is one of the first times that we actually get to see it in full display, and it's amazing. So there's two things to know about the damnation stare. One is that it is unique to Johnny Blaze. Seemingly, no other Ghost Riders have it. And this just largely seems to come out of the point in Marvel Comics when Johnny Blaze became the King of Hell. The other thing here is the difference between the damnation stare and the penance stare. So the penance stare only works on people that have two eyes, and it forces them to endure all the pain and suffering that they've caused. But it doesn't work on people like Thanos or the Punisher, because with Thanos, for example, he loved it. He enjoyed it because he loves causing death and suffering everywhere he goes. And the Punisher genuinely believed that what he was doing was right, so it never really impacted him on that level. But for everybody else, they'll just experience horrible, horrible pain and usually end up in a catatonic state. What the damnation stare does is it judges whether or not that person is allowed to remain on Earth or to be sent to hell. And in this instance, because of everything that Bram and Bagragul had done, they're effectively locked away and presumably sent to hell. We don't know specifically how the power works, and in fact, the ending of this will give us a much better understanding of how this ability functions. But once this stare is done, Johnny Blaze reverts back to his human form. And then of course, the entirety of the Weapons Plus Project Hellfire lab is effectively destroyed, right? The whole place is just burned up and blown up and the whole thing goes away. But while you have Wolverine and Ghost Rider that go about their own business, you have Bram who's still locked away as this kind of stone statue out there in the middle of nowhere. But where a bird lands on this statue itself, Bram is seemingly still there, encased in stone with his eyes glowing red. So what it looks like is this design to just kind of lock a person away, but if they are of sufficient power, they are able to escape. Again, this power hasn't really been used all that often, so we don't know the ins and outs of how it works. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Weapons of Vengeance, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.